Father John Geoghan, let's talk about one of the most infamous cases that shook the Catholic Church worldwide. Geoghan was a Boston priest who seemed, on the surface, gentle and devoted, often working with children. But behind that image, he was a predator. Over the course of his career in the priesthood, more than 130 people, mostly young boys, would accuse him of sexual abuse spanning decades. Here's where it gets darker. Church leaders knew. Time after time, complaints were filed. Instead of removing him, the Archdiocese of Boston quietly shifted him from parish to parish, exposing thousands of new children to risk. Investigations later showed he was reassigned 6 times after authorities inside the church already knew his history. By the late 1990s, Geoghan was finally criminally charged. In 2002, he was convicted of indecent assault and battery for abusing a 10-year-old boy. His sentence was 9 to 10 years in prison. Yet that conviction was just a drop compared to the scale of accusations against him. What makes this case so historic is what happened next. The Boston Globe's Spotlight team uncovered church files proving systematic cover-ups. The story didn't just expose Geoghan, it exposed the entire global pattern of concealment by Catholic leaders. The fallout forced Cardinal Bernard Law, the head of Boston's archdiocese, to resign and sparked lawsuits, criminal prosecutions, and reforms worldwide. Geoghan himself died in prison in 2003, killed by another inmate, but his case lit the fuse. It showed the world how one priest's crimes, shielded for decades, symbolized a crisis that ran across continents. The legacy? A collapse in trust, billions of dollars in settlements, and the start of a global reckoning that the Church still faces today.
Father Paul Shanley. If John Geoghan cracked the door on Boston's abuse scandal, Father Paul Shanley blew it wide open. Shanley was once called a street priest. In the 1970s and 80s, he worked with homeless youth, runaways, and kids struggling with drugs. Outwardly, he was progressive and charismatic. But for decades, while gaining trust among the most vulnerable, Shanley was secretly a serial abuser. Complaints about him were made as early as the 1960s. Records later showed the Archdiocese of Boston knew he'd advocated for adult-child sexual relationships at public events, yet he remained in ministry. Time and again, instead of being removed, he was transferred, echoing the same pattern of cover-ups seen in Geoghan's case. What finally brought him down were accusations of repeated assaults on a boy from age 6 into his teens. In 2005, after years of mounting revelations during the Boston scandal, Shanley was convicted of rape and indecent assault and sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. The scale of the cover-up stunned the public. Shanley's record wasn't just about abuse, it proved how deep denial went inside the church hierarchy. Leaders had evidence for decades, yet allowed him to continue serving. He became a symbol of systemic failure, how institutions shielded predators at the expense of children. Shanley was released from prison in 2017 after serving 12 years, a decision that outraged survivors and advocates. By then, his name had already become shorthand for betrayal, proof that abuse wasn't just the crime of individuals, but of entire institutions that refused to act. The long-term impact? His case reinforced calls for transparency, accountability, and survivor rights. And like Geoghan, Shanley's downfall left permanent cracks in the church's moral authority across the world.
Father Marcial Maciel degollado. Few church figures symbolize betrayal like Marcial Maciel, the Mexican priest who founded the Legion of Christ in 1941. On the surface, he was a visionary, building elite schools, universities, and attracting donations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Vatican leaders praised him as a model servant. Even Pope John Paul II publicly called him an inspiration. But beneath that holy image, Maciel lived a double life. For decades, reports piled up from seminarians who said he abused them as teenagers. He manipulated families, controlled followers with cult-like obedience, and even fathered children while secretly siphoning funds. By the 1990s, at least 30 men had come forward. Victims brought their case to the Vatican, but for years it went nowhere. Maciel's wealth, connections, and fundraising power bought him protection at the highest levels. Criminal prosecution never came, shielded by age, influence, and church politics. It wasn't until 2006, after John Paul's death, that Pope Benedict XVI disciplined him, ordering him to live out his life in prayer and penance. He died in 2008, never convicted. Only afterward did the Vatican finally admit the truth. Yes, Maciel committed grave, systematic abuse and defrauded his own movement. The fallout was seismic. The Legion of Christ nearly collapsed, global trust in Vatican oversight eroded, and his case became proof that financial power had silenced justice. Maciel's legacy lingers as a symbol not just of abuse, but of how deep institutional complicity can run. Father Oliver O'Grady, if you want a chilling glimpse at how predators operated within the church, look at Oliver O'Grady. Born in Ireland, he became a parish priest in California, but starting in the 1970s, he began abusing children across multiple parishes, sometimes befriending families to gain access. Complaints reached church leaders early, yet instead of removing him, the diocese shuffled him to new communities. Each move created new victims. By the time he was finally arrested, investigators uncovered abuse of at least 25 children, some as young as toddlers. In 1993, O'Grady was convicted of sexually abusing two brothers and sentenced to 14 years in prison. He served 7, then was deported back to Ireland. The case exposed not only his crimes, but also glaring failures by bishops who kept him in ministry. His notoriety deepened with the 2006 documentary Deliver Us from Evil, where he appeared on camera speaking casually about his abuse, leaving audiences horrified. That film highlighted not just a perpetrator, but a system that enabled him. Today, O'Grady lives under supervision, but his case is etched in history as one of the clearest examples of how secrecy and transfers let decades of crimes multiply. The long-term impact? Massive lawsuits, multi-million-dollar settlements, and a spotlight on California's church leaders, making his story one of the most infamous in the global abuse crisis. Father Lawrence Murphy, chaplain at St. John's School for the Deaf in Wisconsin. From the 1950s through the 1970s, Murphy is accused of abusing over 200 deaf boys, children who were some of the most vulnerable, often cut off from mainstream support and unable to speak out. By the 1970s, complaints were flooding in. Victims and parents went to church leaders, civil authorities, anyone who might act. Yet Murphy was quietly moved out of the school. He continued living as a priest, with little restriction. In the 1990s, some victims pushed the Vatican to pursue a canonical trial, but internal Vatican documents later revealed disturbing hesitation. Officials, including then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, were aware, but the process stalled. Murphy himself even appealed, writing that he was sick and elderly. Before a trial could begin, Murphy died in 1998, never convicted, never licensed. His case resurfaced globally in 2010, when secret Vatican files were published showing a pattern of stalling and protection at the highest levels. Today, his name symbolizes what so many survivors saw. Not just one priest's crimes, but an institution's failure to act swiftly, even when hundreds of children's testimonies were at stake. Father Gerald Ridsdale. In Australia, no name casts a darker shadow than Father Gerald Ridsdale. From the 1960s through the 1980s, he abused children across multiple parishes, dozens of victims, some as young as 4 years old. Every time suspicion grew, he was moved. In total, Ridsdale faced more than 70 convictions for child sexual abuse, crimes committed over decades. What horrified Australians was not only his acts, but who knew. Evidence showed church leaders, including figures like George Pell, later a cardinal, were aware of repeated complaints. Instead of stopping Ridsdale, they transferred him to new communities, perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Ridsdale was finally convicted in 1994 and received multiple sentences. Over the years, as new victims came forward, his jail time lengthened, well over 30 years behind bars. Even into his 80s, he faced fresh charges, marking him as one of Australia's most notorious predators in collar. The broader impact was seismic.
Ridsdale's crimes helped trigger the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, the most comprehensive inquiry of its kind worldwide. That investigation exposed decades of cover-ups in Australia, forcing public apologies, compensation, and revealing how deep the problem had been hidden. In the end, Ridsdale became not just a face of monstrous abuse, but a stark reminder that silence and power can destroy generations.
Father Tony Walsh. In 1980s Dublin, Father Tony Walsh was known as the Singing Priest. He performed church events, appeared on TV, even entertained children with music. But behind the public charm was a predator. Walsh began abusing children soon after ordination. His victims were boys he met through parish life and school gatherings. One archbishop later described him as a serial abuser of the worst kind. Allegations mounted for years, yet instead of being removed, he was moved between parishes and sent to treatment programs that failed. Finally, in 1997, Walsh was convicted of multiple counts of sexual assault against young boys, with sentences later extended in 2010 when further survivors came forward. He is now serving a long prison term. What made his case even darker was how blatantly the church knew. The Murphy Report, Ireland's major investigation into church abuse, revealed that Dublin's hierarchy had evidence of Walsh's crimes for over a decade, but consistently protected him. The betrayal stung Ireland deeply. A trusted figure on stage and in church halls was destroying lives while leaders looked away. Walsh remains one of the most notorious examples of how public trust was weaponized and why Ireland's faith in the church collapsed in the 2000s. Father Brendan Smyth. If there was a single case that jolted Ireland and beyond into full awareness of clerical abuse, it was Father Brendan Smyth. An Irish Norbertine priest, Smyth abused children for over 40 years across Ireland, Scotland, and even the United States. His victims, both boys and girls, numbered in the dozens. For decades, Smyth was moved from parish to parish whenever suspicion surfaced. Each transfer meant fresh victims. Arrest warrants were even delayed by officials, allowing him to continue his crimes unchecked. In 1994, Smyth was convicted in Northern Ireland of abusing 4 children, with later trials confirming a pattern that stretched back to the 1950s. He served prison sentences until his death in 1997, but by then, the political fallout was massive. The scandal around Smyth's delayed extradition from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland directly triggered the collapse of the Irish government in 1994. It showed not just ecclesiastical failure, but political collusion in shielding predators. In the end, Smyth isn't only remembered for his horrific crimes, he's remembered as the priest whose exposure finally made denial impossible. His case forced Ireland into an era of unprecedented scrutiny, breaking the silence that had protected abusers for decades. Father Curtis Wehmeyer. In the early 2000s, he was a rising priest in St. Paul, Minnesota, often described as friendly and involved with parish youth. But beneath that, he was a predator whose case became a turning point for the U.S. Church. In 2012, Wehmeyer was arrested and later convicted of multiple counts of sexual abuse against 2 young brothers, as well as possession of child pornography. He groomed the boys with alcohol, drugs, and camping trips, exploiting their trust. His sentence was 5 years in prison, later expanded with additional federal charges. But the larger impact wasn't just his conviction, it was the backlash against how the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis handled his case. Records revealed that Archbishop John Neenstedt and other officials knew for years that Wehmeyer had troubling behavior, including warnings about his interest in young boys. Yet he was promoted to pastor and even given control of a parish with a school. When this became public in 2015, the scandal exploded. Survivors' voices amplified, lawsuits mounted, and Neenstedt himself resigned under pressure.
The entire Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis eventually filed for bankruptcy protection due to payouts exceeding $200 million to victims. Wehmeyer's crimes weren't just the failings of one man. They pulled down an archbishop, bankrupted a diocese, and showed how institutional silence perpetuated danger. Father Norbert Maday. In Illinois, the case of Father Norbert Maday exposed how widespread cover-ups had become. Ordained in the 1960s, Maday served for decades as a parish priest and youth chaplain. But behind the collar, he was committing repeated assaults against altar boys during trips and events. Complaints surfaced in the early 1990s, and in 1994, he was convicted of molesting 2 boys during a retreat. Sentenced to 20 years in prison, Maday became one of the earliest U.S. priests imprisoned as the abuse crisis was coming to light. His trial was significant because of what it revealed. Maday had been shuffled between assignments, sometimes reassigned despite warnings, an exact echo of what would later be seen in Boston and other dioceses. That practice of quietly relocating priests instead of removing them showed how the church's system itself had enabled repeated abuse. By the 2000s, more lawsuits poured in against Maday and the archdiocese, uncovering other victims and deepening the pattern of institutional failure. He was released from prison in 2010 under supervision, but his case remained a stark lesson in how early warnings were ignored until too late. Maday's story reinforced a theme survivors already knew. Predators thrived not because nobody knew, but because too many people in power refused to act. Father Thomas Adamson. When people talk about the very first cracks in America's wall of silence, they often begin with Father Thomas Adamson of Minnesota. Ordained in the 1950s, Adamson served across several parishes. Complaints about his behavior with boys surfaced as early as the 1960s. But rather than remove him, church officials moved him from one parish to another for decades. Confidential memos later revealed bishops openly admitted his behavior was dangerous, yet they still concealed it. In the 1980s, Adamson's victims finally turned to civil courts. One lawsuit in 1984 became historic. It was the first publicly reported clergy abuse case in the U.S. It exposed how long the church had known and did nothing. Adamson was later criminally charged as well, including pleading guilty to abusing a 14-year-old in 1993. But the bigger impact wasn't just his conviction, it was the precedent his case set. By piercing secrecy, Adamson's lawsuits made it possible for other survivors nationwide to come forward. He died in 2013, but his name represents the beginning of the end of silence in America, a reminder that one case can open the floodgates of accountability. Father Fernando Karadima. In Chile, few scandals hit harder than the downfall of Fernando Karadima, once regarded as a spiritual giant. For decades, Karadima ran a prestigious parish in Santiago, mentoring young men, many of whom became bishops. To Chile's elite, he was a saintly figure. But in reality, Karadima was systematically abusing teenage boys under his care. Survivors later described how he manipulated, groomed, and controlled them, even convincing them his actions were spiritual grace. His influence silenced complaints because his protégés held cower at the top of Chile's church. In 2010, several victims spoke publicly. Initially dismissed, their testimony was confirmed by a Vatican investigation. In 2011, Karadima was found guilty by the Vatican of abusing minors and sentenced to a life of prayer and seclusion. Civil courts also later confirmed findings, though prosecutions were limited by statutes of limitation. The revelations shook Chile to its core. By 2018, the scandal spread so wide that every active Chilean bishop offered their resignation to Pope Francis, who accepted several. It was an extraordinary collapse of credibility, sparked by one priest's crimes. Karadima died in 2021,
but his case remains the single most devastating church scandal in Latin America, proving how deeply abuse could be woven into church hierarchies.
Father Pierre Pican. In 2001, France witnessed its first criminal conviction of a bishop, not for personally abusing, but for hiding another priest's crimes. That bishop was Pierre Pican. As leader of the Diocese of Bayeux, Pican knew that one of his priests, Father René Bisset, was abusing minors. Instead of alerting police, Pican quietly reassigned him. Years later, Bisset was convicted and sentenced to 18 years for multiple child abuse counts. When investigators traced how long the diocese knew, they charged Pican under France's mandatory reporting laws. He admitted he stayed silent to protect the church. In 2001, he received a 3-month suspended sentence, making him the first French bishop in history convicted for shielding abuse. Though his punishment was light, the symbolism was massive. It marked a turning point. For centuries, bishops had absolute impunity. Pican's conviction sent a message that even senior clergy could be treated as accomplices when they put the institution above victims. His case paved the way for broader inquiries and forced France to confront how deeply silence had enabled predators.
Father Paul Moore, long seen as quiet, insulated communities, were rocked in 2018 by the conviction of Father Paul Moore. A priest with decades of service in Jersey, Moore presented as trustworthy. But survivors later revealed a dark truth. He'd assaulted children going back to the 1960s and 70s. Moore was found guilty in 2018 of sexually abusing boys as young as 12. Testimony showed a pattern of grooming and exploiting his clerical authority. The verdict was especially painful because rumors and warnings about him had floated for years, yet officials in both church and community circles had failed to act. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison. The conviction came amid broader exposure of historic abuse in Britain and on the islands, reinforcing that even remote communities were not immune to systemic silence. Moore's downfall taught a chilling lesson. Trusted figures in small, tight-knit parishes could evade justice for generations if institutions chose denial.
Father Pierino Gelmini, a country where priests often held celebrity status, none fell harder than Father Pierino Gelmini. For decades, he was famous as the founder of the Comunità Incontro, a rehab network for struggling youth. He was praised by politicians, appeared in the media, and built a reputation as a savior for the vulnerable. But beneath the fame lay years of abuse. In 2007, young men from his centers began coming forward accusing him of sexual assaults. Investigations uncovered a pattern of manipulation. Vulnerable teenagers living in his care, dependent on him for shelter and support, were groomed and coerced. By the late 2000s, Gelmini faced trial on multiple counts. Before it concluded, he admitted to misconduct with some victims while denying others, but public trust was shattered. Though he avoided a harsh sentence due to his age and health, his community collapsed under scandal. Gelmini died in 2014, but his downfall was symbolic. For Italians, it wasn't just about one priest. It was about the exposure of someone once held up as a national hero, now revealed as a predator shielded for far too long.